3 weeks after Harold's funeral, my son invited me to dinner upstairs. He still called it Sunday family dinner, even though by then it no longer felt much like family. Outside, October rain drifted across Sycamore Lane in thin gray sheets, while Bears pregame coverage played softly from the living room television. Somebody in the neighborhood already had pumpkins on their porch. Somebody else still had a faded American flag hanging crooked beside the garage. Normal suburban things, the kind Harold used to notice during commercials and make little comments about. Tom Jensen still hasn't fixed that gutter, he'd mutter from his recliner. I remember those details now, more than the big moments. Funny how grief works that way. I parked beside Daniel's SUV and sat in the driveway longer than I should have. The casserole dish on my lap had already started cooling through the towel wrapped around it. Scalloped potatoes, Harold's favorite, the same recipe I'd brought to church potlucks for 20 years. Part of me almost turned around and went home. But home didn't feel entirely like mine anymore either. That had started slowly after Harold passed. Little changes. Furniture moved slightly, different groceries in the refrigerator. Amelia replacing my hand soap with expensive lavender foam that smelled like a hotel lobby. None of it seemed important on its own. Still, I noticed. When I walked inside, Amelia was arranging salad into a large white bowl, while music played quietly from a speaker near the sink. Some soft, acoustic version of an old Fleetwood Mac song. "Hi, Maureen," she said warmly. Not Mom, not even Mrs. Whitmore anymore. Just Maureen. I told myself not to read into it. Daniel came down the hallway, carrying grocery bags from Jewel Osco. "Hey, Mom." He leaned in to kiss my cheek, distracted already, car keys still in one hand. He looked tired, older than 43. His tie hung loosened at the collar, like he had another long day at the office. "Traffic was awful," he muttered. "They've got half of Naperville under construction." I smiled faintly. For a second, things almost felt normal. Then Amelia opened the refrigerator and frowned lightly. "Oh no, I forgot to pick up Diet Coke for you." "You didn't need to do that." "I know, but still." She said it kindly enough. And maybe she meant it kindly. That's the confusing part when people start shifting around you. Nothing sounds cruel at first. If anything, it sounds thoughtful, helpful. I set the casserole on the counter while Daniel unpacked groceries beside me. Almond milk, organic coffee creamer, expensive bottled water. Things Harold used to call money with labels. Then I noticed something small. The mail pile near the microwave had been separated into neat stacks with sticky notes attached. Utilities, insurance, taxes. Harold usually handled the sorting himself. He liked paper bills, said online banking made people careless. I looked at the labels a second too long, and Amelia noticed. "We've been trying to get things organized," she said casually, while rinsing lettuce. "There was so much paperwork after everything with Harold." After everything with Harold. Not after your husband died. Just slightly removed language. Not cold enough to question directly, just distant enough to feel different. Daniel stepped in quickly. "It's honestly been a mess, Mom. Insurance stuff, property taxes, half the accounts still had Dad's name attached." He sounded stressed, not manipulative. That mattered. I nodded slowly. "I can go through it this week." "You don't have to worry about it tonight," Amelia said with an easy smile. "Dinner first." Again, perfectly reasonable. That's what made it hard to trust my instincts in those early weeks, because nothing they said sounded wrong out loud. The dining room looked different from the last time I'd really noticed it. New centerpiece, different curtains maybe? I couldn't tell if I was imagining that part. The candles smelled faintly like cinnamon and cedar. Amelia always decorated early for fall. Harold used to tease her about it. "Women start celebrating October before Labor Day's even over." I could almost hear him saying it. Daniel poured wine while football commentary drifted in from the other room. Somewhere upstairs, the dryer buzzed. Domestic sounds, familiar sounds. But I kept feeling slightly out of rhythm, inside my own family. Dinner itself started pleasantly enough. Daniel talked about interest rates and layoffs happening at a firm downtown. Amelia mentioned somebody from their HOA arguing over mailbox paint colors. I told them Doris from church had dropped off a lemon loaf cake no one in my house was going to finish. Little, ordinary conversations. Still, there were moments that snagged at me. Daniel asking whether I'd remembered to refill one of my prescriptions.
Amelia gently suggesting maybe I should let Daniel handle a few online accounts, just in case. None of it sounded alarming. That's important to understand. If somebody had openly tried controlling me back then, I would have pushed back immediately. But concern? Practical help? Family support after a funeral? That's harder to argue with, especially when you're grieving.
At one point, Daniel reached for the casserole dish. These are exactly like Dad liked them. For the first time all evening, his voice cracked a little. Real grief, not performance. I looked at my son sitting there beneath the warm dining room lights, rubbing tired eyes after a long work week, and suddenly I felt guilty for even questioning him. Maybe I was being oversensitive. Maybe grief really was making everything feel sharper than it should. I wanted to believe that. Then Amelia spoke again. "Have you thought any more about getting someone to help around the house?" The question landed softly, not aggressive, not suspicious, almost normal. I took a sip of water before answering. "With what?" "Oh, just everyday things," she said, "especially heading into winter. The stairs, groceries, driving once the roads get icy." Daniel nodded immediately. Honestly, the driveway alone worries me. Worries me. There it was again. Not pressure, not control. Worry. Reasonable, protective, hard to fight without sounding defensive. I folded my napkin carefully in my lap. "I've handled winters before." "I know," Daniel said quickly. "Nobody's saying otherwise." And he sounded sincere. That made it harder. Rain tapped softly against the windows, while the television crowd roared faintly from the Bears game in the other room. For a few minutes, nobody said much. Amelia stood to clear plates before anyone finished completely. Efficient, polite, always moving. I followed her into the kitchen automatically. "You don't need to help," she said lightly. "I'm not helpless." The words came out sharper than I intended. She glanced at me quickly, surprised, then softened immediately. "Of course you're not. I just meant you've had a hard month." A hard month. Again, technically true. That was the problem. I dried dishes while she loaded the dishwasher, with the kind of quiet coordination women sometimes develop around each other over years. For a second, it almost felt comforting. Then I noticed Harold's favorite coffee mug, shoved near the back of an upper cabinet. Not gone, just moved. I can't explain why that bothered me so much. Maybe because grief already makes you feel like the person disappeared overnight. Seeing their things quietly relocated somehow makes it feel more permanent. Amelia followed my eyes. "Oh," she said gently. "I moved some things around while cleaning." I nodded. No accusation, no confrontation. Still, something inside me tightened slightly. Later, Daniel walked me toward the front door, while Amelia packed leftovers into glass containers behind us. The rain had slowed outside. Wet leaves clung to the driveway beneath the porch light. "Mom," Daniel said carefully, "you know we're just trying to make things easier for you, right?" There it was again. Easier. I looked at him for a long moment. He looked exhausted, genuinely exhausted, not like a villain, like a middle-aged man trying to keep too many parts of his life from collapsing at once. And maybe that's why I missed the warning signs at first, because nothing about him looked cruel, just overwhelmed. "I know," I said quietly. He nodded with visible relief. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "We should probably sit down soon and go through some of Dad's paperwork together. There are still accounts and insurance things tied up." Normal sentence. Reasonable sentence. But something about the timing unsettled me anyway. Not enough to argue, just enough to remember later. I drove home through wet suburban streets, lined with orange porch lights and half-empty Halloween decorations drooping in the rain. Somebody had left a giant inflatable ghost running in their yard despite the weather. Harold would have laughed at that. When I pulled into my driveway, the house looked darker than usual. Bigger, too. That happens after 40 years with someone. The walls don't physically change after they're gone, but the space around you does. Inside, the kitchen still smelled faintly like coffee from that morning. Harold's reading glasses sat beside the newspaper, exactly where he left them before his final hospital stay. I stood there for a while without turning on the lights. Then I noticed something that made my stomach tighten just slightly. Harold's office door upstairs was closed. Not unusual on its own, but when I walked up and tried the handle, it was locked. A couple weeks passed after that dinner. Not dramatic weeks, just ordinary late October days, where grief settled into the house differently every morning. Some days I woke up almost functional.
Other days, I'd stand in the cereal aisle at Jewel, staring at 2 brands of oatmeal because Harold always ate maple brown sugar, and my brain still expected him to be home asking where I put it. People talk about grief like it's constant sadness. It isn't. Most of the time, it's disruption. You lose your rhythm with ordinary life. By the end of October, the trees along Sycamore Lane had mostly gone bare. Wet leaves clogged storm drains around the neighborhood, and somebody in the HOA Facebook group kept posting passive-aggressive complaints about Halloween decorations staying up too long. Harold would have gotten a kick out of that. He loved neighborhood drama, as long as it didn't involve him. I still caught myself turning to tell him things sometimes. That part hadn't gotten easier yet. Daniel and Amelia started coming by more often during those weeks, or maybe I noticed it more. Hard to say. At first, I appreciated the company. Daniel brought groceries over after work a few times. Amelia picked up prescriptions from Walgreens when my knee was bothering me. One Saturday morning, they showed up with pumpkin muffins and spent 3 hours helping clean out the garage refrigerator Harold never remembered to unplug during winter. Normal family things. Helpful things. That's why it took me longer than it should have to feel uncomfortable. One Thursday afternoon, Amelia stood at my kitchen counter sorting mail while I made soup. Nothing unusual about that either. At least, not at first. The kitchen smelled like onions and thyme, and local news played softly from the television in the den, some story about rising heating bills heading into winter. Amelia flipped through envelopes neatly. "Mostly junk," she said. Then, "Oh, your homeowner's insurance went up again." I looked over from the stove. "What?" She handed me the envelope. "Almost everybody's did. Daniel said property coverage is getting crazy around here." Again, reasonable. Everything always sounded reasonable. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and skimmed the paperwork while soup simmered behind me. "I'll deal with it tomorrow." "You don't have to rush," Amelia said casually. "We can always help organize some of this stuff if it starts feeling overwhelming." Overwhelming. Not offensive, not controlling, just a word. Still, something about hearing it made me oddly defensive. Maybe because Harold handled most of the insurance paperwork during our marriage. Not because I couldn't, mostly because he enjoyed that kind of thing in a strange way. Spreadsheets relaxed him. I set the envelope beside the coffee maker. "I'm all right." "I know you are," Amelia said quickly. Then she smiled and changed the subject so smoothly, I almost questioned whether the moment happened at all. That became its own kind of confusion after a while. Nothing stayed uncomfortable long enough to confront directly.
A few days later, Daniel came over during the Bears game carrying takeout from Portillo's and a stack of printed tax forms. "I figured we could knock some of this out together," he said. The television played low in the background while rain tapped against the living room windows. Harold's recliner still faced the same spot beside the lamp, untouched since the funeral. Daniel sat at the dining room table, flipping through paperwork while fries cooled between us. "I honestly didn't realize how much stuff Dad managed," he admitted. He sounded tired, more than manipulative. That mattered to me. "He kept records on everything," I said. "Yeah, no kidding." He gave a small laugh, then rubbed his forehead. "My God, Mom, there are like 6 different accounts tied to property taxes alone." I watched him for a moment. There were dark circles under his eyes now, almost constantly. His shirts looked more wrinkled than they used to. Even his haircut had started growing out too long around the ears. Stress showed on Daniel physically, always had. When he was 16 and applying for colleges, he got tension headaches so bad he once threw up before an SAT prep class. "You don't have to do this tonight," I told him. "No, it's okay." He leaned back in the chair. "Honestly, I'd rather get ahead of it before year-end stuff starts piling up." Again, reasonable. That was the difficult part. I sat down across from him and started sorting receipts into piles. For a while, it almost felt comforting. Just mother and son handling paperwork together while football announcers argued in the background. Then Daniel looked up from one of the folders. "You ever think about downsizing eventually?" The question landed casually enough, almost too casually. I kept my attention on the receipts. "Not really." He nodded slowly. "Just financially, I mean. Property taxes around here are brutal now." There it was again. Not pressure, exactly, but direction, a gentle steering of the conversation. I didn't answer immediately. Outside, headlights slid across wet pavement as neighbors came home from church dinners and grocery runs.
Somebody's inflatable skeleton had collapsed sideways into their bushes across the street.
Then Daniel said something that stayed with me afterward. Dad worried about the house expenses more than he admitted. That surprised me. Harold rarely worried openly about money. Cautious, yes. Obsessive about paperwork, definitely. But worried? Not often. When did he say that? Daniel shrugged. Just conversations here and there. Something about the answer felt unfinished. Not necessarily dishonest, just incomplete. I rinsed ketchup off my plate at the sink and kept thinking about it long after Daniel left. That night, I walked upstairs to Harold's office again, still locked. I stood there a moment longer this time, not because I thought something dramatic was happening behind the door, mostly because Harold never used to lock it unless he was on business calls or sorting tax records. Eventually, I went back downstairs and made tea. I told myself not to overthink ordinary things. That's what widows do sometimes. We start assigning meaning to every little shift because the world already proved how quickly life can change. A few days later, Doris from church stopped by with frozen casseroles and enough gossip to fill an entire Thanksgiving weekend. She sat at my kitchen island, stirring sweet and low into coffee, while asking careful questions about how I was holding up. That phrase becomes its own kind of script after funerals. People don't know what else to say. "Daniel and Amelia helping you out much?" she asked. "Oh, they've been around." "That's good." She nodded approvingly. Kids get busy once they hit that age. Careers, mortgages, all that. Mortgages. Funny how often money kept drifting into conversations lately. Before leaving, Doris lowered her voice slightly. "Amelia seems very organized." Not criticism, not praise either, just observation. I remember watching Doris sig her raincoat near the front door, while wondering whether I sounded defensive when I answered, "She likes keeping things in order." Doris nodded once. Then, "Well, sometimes that's helpful." The wording stayed with me longer than I expected.
By early November, Daniel had started stopping by after work at least twice a week, sometimes with groceries, sometimes with paperwork, sometimes for no clear reason at all. One evening, he helped me carry boxes of Harold's winter clothes down to the basement storage bins. Halfway down the stairs, he paused and looked around the house quietly. "You know," he said, "this place is a lot for one person." I kept folding sweaters. "I've managed so far." "I know," he hesitated. "I just mean long-term." Long-term. There was that phrase again. Not immediate, not urgent, future-focused, practical, hard to argue with. I looked up at him finally. "You worried about me or the house?" The question surprised him. "Both," he admitted after a second. At least that answer sounded honest. He sat down on the basement steps heavily. "Mom, I'm trying to be realistic here." And for the first time, I heard genuine financial strain in his voice underneath everything else. Not greed, pressure, different thing entirely. "Things are expensive right now," he continued quietly. "Mortgage rates are insane. Taxes keep going up. We're trying to stay ahead of stuff too." There it was. Not a confession, but close enough to glimpse what sat underneath all the concern. I folded one of Harold's flannel shirts slower than necessary. "What does that have to do with me?" Daniel rubbed both hands over his face. "Nothing. Forget it." But people rarely say forget it when they truly mean nothing. Later that same week, I got a voicemail from Richard Lawson, Harold's attorney. Short, professional, polite. "Maureen, when you have a moment, give me a call. Nothing urgent, just need clarification on a few remaining account details." Normal message. Still, something about it unsettled me. Maybe because Richard sounded more careful than usual, or maybe because by then I'd already started paying closer attention to the spaces between conversations instead of the conversations themselves. That night, I called him back from the kitchen while pasta boiled on the stove. Richard exchanged condolences again before clearing his throat. "Quick question," he said. "You haven't signed any new financial authorization forms recently, correct?" I frowned slightly. "No." A pause. Not long, just enough to notice. "All right," he said. "Good. I simply wanted to confirm." "Confirm what?" I almost asked. But before I could, Richard shifted the conversation back toward routine estate paperwork so smoothly, it made me wonder afterward whether I imagined the tension entirely. Still, after we hung up, I stood in the kitchen longer than necessary, listening to water bubble inside the pasta pot, while November wind rattled the windows above the sink.
And for the first time since Harold died, I had the distinct feeling something inside my family was slowly reorganizing itself around me without fully including me in the process.
By the middle of November, the house had started feeling crowded in a way I couldn't quite explain. Not physically crowded, emotionally. Daniel and Amelia weren't staying overnight or anything dramatic like that, but they were around constantly now. Grocery bags on my counters, Amelia's reusable water bottles near the sink, Daniel's laptop charger plugged into the outlet beside Harold's chair like it belonged there. Little signs of overlap, the kind families barely notice while they're happening. One Saturday afternoon, Amelia stood in my laundry room reorganizing cleaning supplies while I clipped coupons at the kitchen table. Outside, the first real cold front of the season had rolled through northern Illinois overnight. Bare branches scraped softly against the windows, and somebody nearby had started Christmas lights too early. Harold would have complained about that too. People rush every holiday now, he used to say. Nobody lets seasons breathe anymore. I missed hearing things like that. Amelia carried a cardboard donation box through the kitchen. "Do you still want all these old towels?" she asked. I looked up. Inside the box were dish towels, extra blankets, and a few of Harold's old flannel shirts mixed together. My chest tightened slightly at the sight of them. I hadn't decided yet. "Oh," she stopped immediately. "I wasn't getting rid of anything important. I just figured we could start simplifying a little before winter." Simplifying. There was that word again. Not aggressive, not suspicious. Actually pretty normal for someone helping after a death. And maybe that's why I kept second-guessing myself. Because if I described any of this out loud to friends at church, most of them probably would have called Amelia thoughtful, organized, helpful, practical. Maybe she even believed she was. That possibility bothered me almost more than outright cruelty would have. Later that afternoon, Daniel came over carrying pharmacy bags and a space heater he insisted I needed for the upstairs hallway. "You shouldn't be freezing in this place," he said while plugging it in near the guest room. "I've survived 68 Illinois winters." "Yeah, but heating costs are ridiculous now." He shrugged. "No reason to waste money warming rooms nobody uses." Again, reasonable. That was the exhausting part. Every conversation left me feeling vaguely unsettled, without giving me a clear reason why. The heater hummed softly while football commentators argued downstairs about playoff standings. Amelia wiped down kitchen counters with lavender spray that smelled too sweet for November. Daniel glanced toward the staircase. "You still haven't gotten that office door looked at?" I paused. "No." "You sure the lock isn't jammed?" Jammed. Interesting choice of word. Not locked. I watched him carefully for a second. "Maybe." He nodded too quickly and looked away. A small moment. Easy to miss. But by then, I had started noticing how often both of them watched my reactions before answering questions. That evening, we ordered pizza because Amelia said nobody felt like cooking. We ate in the den with paper plates balanced on our knees, while snow flurries drifted outside the windows for the first time that season. For a while, things almost felt warm again. Normal. Daniel laughed at a commercial. Amelia asked whether I wanted another blanket. Someone knocked over ranch dressing onto the coffee table, and we all reached for napkins at the same time. Family rhythm. Then Daniel muted the television during halftime. "Mom," he said carefully, "have you thought any more about maybe hiring somebody to help out around here a few days a week?" Not a shocking question. Plenty of women my age hire help after losing a spouse. Still, my stomach tightened anyway. With what exactly? "Oh, just regular stuff," Amelia said lightly. "Driving if the weather gets bad? Errands? House things?" Daniel nodded. It wouldn't hurt to make life easier. There it was again. Easier. Always softer language. Never direct pressure. I folded my napkin slowly. "I'm managing." "I know," Daniel said quickly. "Nobody thinks otherwise." But the speed of the response bothered me, like he already expected resistance. Outside, headlights swept briefly across the living room ceiling as neighbors pulled into driveways after Saturday errands. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked nonstop until someone finally called it inside.
Normal suburban noise. And underneath it, this low, steady feeling that conversations around me had started carrying hidden meanings. Not lies exactly, just omissions.
After dinner, Amelia cleaned the kitchen, while Daniel stayed behind helping me sort old mail. Most of it was junk. Holiday catalogs, medical statements, church donation envelopes. Then Daniel picked up one of the prescription receipts from Walgreens. "You should probably switch these to auto refill," he said casually. "I've managed prescriptions before." "I know." He hesitated. "I'm just saying, it's easy to forget stuff when you're stressed." There it was, small enough to dismiss, personal enough to sting. I looked at him directly. "Have I forgotten things lately?" His expression changed immediately. Not guilt exactly, discomfort. "I didn't mean it like that." "Like what?" Daniel leaned back in the chair heavily. "Mom, come on." No answer, just deflection. The kitchen faucet ran behind us while Amelia loaded the dishwasher. I watched my son stare down at a pile of unopened mail instead of looking at me. And for the first time, I wondered whether conversations about me had started happening without me there. That thought stayed with me long after they left. A few days later, Doris from church invited me to lunch at Panera after Bible study. The place smelled like broccoli cheddar soup and wet coats from the weather outside. Women our age sat crowded around tiny tables discussing grandkids, knee replacements, and holiday travel plans. Normal things. Safe things. Doris stirred her coffee for a while before speaking carefully. "You holding up all right over there alone?" "I'm all right." She nodded slowly. "I saw Amelia at Mariana's the other day." Something in her tone made me look up. "She was just picking up groceries," Doris added quickly. "She mentioned you'd had a rough couple weeks." Rough. I tried remembering whether I'd complained recently. Nothing came to mind. "She worries," I said finally. "I'm sure she does." Doris smiled faintly after that, but the conversation drifted somewhere uncomfortable anyway. "Not because of anything dramatic," she said, "because I suddenly realized Amelia had probably started describing me to other people in ways I couldn't hear. Not maliciously necessarily, but carefully, subtly, enough to shape perception." I drove home through sleet, feeling strangely tired. By then, the Christmas decorations around town had fully arrived. Lit wreaths hanging from lampposts downtown, inflatable Santas leaning sideways in frozen yards, Salvation Army bells outside Jewel. Harold always hated how early stores decorated for Christmas. "Country skips Thanksgiving completely now," he'd grumble every year. When I pulled into the driveway, Daniel's SUV was already there. That surprised me. Inside, I found him standing in the kitchen with stacks of paperwork spread across the island counter. Property tax documents, insurance forms, retirement statements. Amelia stood beside him, highlighting sections with a yellow marker. Both of them looked up a little too fast when I walked in. "Hey," Daniel said, "we were just trying to organize some year-end stuff." Again, reasonable, but something about seeing them together over my paperwork unsettled me immediately. "I can handle it." "I know," Daniel said quickly. "We're just trying to get ahead of deadlines." Deadlines. Money. Taxes. Insurance. Everything lately seemed connected to urgency. Amelia slid a folder toward me gently. "Some of these forms probably need your signature eventually, but there's no rush." Probably. Eventually. No rush. Soft language around hard things. I skimmed the paperwork without sitting down. Most of it looked routine. Then I noticed a sticky note attached to one folder. "Need updated emergency contact info." My eyes paused there longer than they should have. "Why does this need updating?" Daniel answered before Amelia could. Dad was still primary contact on a few accounts. Logical answer. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling something underneath the conversation remained unfinished. I set the folder back down carefully. "I'll look through everything later." The room shifted slightly after that. Not tension exactly, more like disappointment nobody wanted to acknowledge openly. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. "Mom, nobody's trying to pressure you." The fact that he said it without me accusing him bothered me more than if he hadn't said anything at all. That night after they left, I made tea and carried it upstairs. The hallway felt colder than usual despite the space heater Daniel installed earlier that week. I passed Harold's office again. Still closed. Still locked. For some reason, I tried the handle anyway. No change.
I stood there listening to the faint hum of the heater and the distant sound of traffic drifting through the windows from Route 59. Then I noticed something I was almost certain hadn't been there before. A thin scratch near the keyhole. Small, probably meaningless. Still, I touched it with my fingertip and felt a strange heaviness settle low in my stomach. Not fear exactly, just the growing realization that somewhere over the past month, my family had quietly started treating my life like something that needed managing, instead of simply living.
By the week before Thanksgiving, I had started dreading the sound of my own doorbell. Not because Daniel and Amelia were rude. That almost would have been easier. They were attentive, reliable, always offering help before I asked for it. Amelia kept my refrigerator stocked. Daniel shoveled my driveway after the first real snow without needing to be told. If my porch light flickered, he replaced the bulb before I even noticed. From the outside, they probably looked like the kind of adult children people at church quietly envied. Maybe part of me envied it too. But somewhere underneath all the kindness, I had begun feeling managed. That feeling is difficult to explain unless you've lived through it yourself. Nobody grabs control all at once. It happens gradually, one practical decision at a time, until suddenly your own routines no longer fully belong to you. The Tuesday before Thanksgiving, Amelia showed up around noon carrying grocery bags from Mariano's and 2 mums for my front porch. "I figured yours probably froze already," she said, as she brushed snowflakes off her coat. I thanked her and moved aside so she could come in. The kitchen smelled faintly like cinnamon oatmeal from breakfast, and the local weather forecast droned softly from the television in the den. Another storm system moving across northern Illinois by the weekend. Amelia unloaded groceries while talking casually about Thanksgiving plans. "We're thinking maybe everybody comes here this year," she said. I looked up from the sink. "Here?" "Well, your dining room fits more people," she smiled lightly. "And honestly, it might be easier on you not having to drive back at night." Easier on you. Again. I dried my hands slowly on a dish towel. "I've driven at night before." "I know," she said quickly. "I just meant if weather gets bad." Always softened, always reasonable. That was what made every conversation so exhausting afterward. Nothing sounded wrong enough to object to directly, yet I kept walking away feeling like something had quietly shifted under my feet. Amelia lined canned goods neatly inside the pantry while I rinsed coffee mugs near the sink. Then she said something casually that stayed with me all afternoon. "Daniel worries about you being here alone more than he says." I didn't answer immediately. Outside, snow flurries drifted past the backyard fence, while somebody nearby ran a leaf blower, even though winter had practically arrived already. "What exactly worries him?" I asked finally. She hesitated, just long enough to seem careful. "I think losing Harold scared him." Not manipulative on the surface, actually believable. And that was the hardest part by then, realizing most controlling behavior arrives dressed as concern.
Later that evening, Daniel stopped by after work carrying a stack of folders and a box of Dunkin' coffee. "Figured we could knock out some year-end stuff tonight," he said. He looked exhausted again, tie loosened, snow melting into the shoulders of his wool coat. He'd started rubbing his jaw constantly during conversations lately, like he carried permanent tension there. The dining room table disappeared under paperwork within 20 minutes. Tax statements, insurance renewals, retirement account summaries, utility records, ordinary adult paperwork. Still, I noticed Daniel increasingly spoke about my finances using words like streamline, simplify, and consolidate. Corporate language, efficiency language, not emotional language. At one point, he glanced around the dining room and sighed quietly. "This house costs more to maintain than you probably realize." I looked up from a stack of receipts. "I'm aware of my own bills." "I know," he leaned back immediately. "That came out wrong." But then he kept going anyway. "Mom, I'm just trying to be practical. Property taxes alone out here are getting insane. Heating costs, maintenance, insurance. Dad handled a lot of this stuff quietly." There it was again, practical. That word had started appearing in almost every conversation lately. Not loving, not family, practical. I watched snow collect slowly along the backyard fence, while football highlights flickered silently across the muted television in the next room. Then I asked something I hadn't planned on saying out loud. "Are you in financial trouble?" Daniel froze for half a second. Small reaction, easy to miss if you didn't know him well. Then he gave a short laugh. "No, nothing dramatic.
Not an answer. He shuffled paperwork instead of looking at me. We're just trying to stay ahead of things like everybody else. Everybody else. Mortgage rates, credit card debt, college savings, retirement pressure. Middle-aged suburban life had become expensive in ways Harold's generation never fully understood. I knew that. But I also knew Daniel only talked around subjects when he didn't want to tell the full truth. Amelia entered carrying fresh coffee before I could push further. "Anybody hungry?" she asked brightly. The conversation dissolved after that, which I think may have been intentional. Over the next couple weeks, more little adjustments started happening around the house. Nothing dramatic enough to confront directly. Daniel added emergency contacts to the refrigerator calendar without asking. Amelia reorganized the mudroom to make winter easier. My pharmacy app somehow started sending refill notifications to Daniel too. That last one bothered me most. Not because I thought they were stealing anything, because I couldn't remember authorizing it. I stood in my kitchen one evening, staring at the Walgreens notification on Daniel's phone while he helped unload groceries. "Oh," he said quickly, "you probably checked the family contact option at some point." Probably, maybe. Grief makes your memory feel less trustworthy sometimes, even when nothing is actually wrong with it. And people around you begin treating uncertainty like permission. That realization settled heavily into me over those weeks.
The Sunday before Thanksgiving, Doris from church called while I was making chicken noodle soup. "You still coming Wednesday night?" she asked. Our church hosted a small Thanksgiving potluck every year before the holiday weekend. "I think so." "Well, good." She lowered her voice slightly. "You've been cooped up too much lately." I almost laughed at that, because without realizing it, Doris had touched the exact feeling I hadn't known how to describe. Cooped up. Not trapped exactly, just increasingly contained. That evening, Daniel and Amelia came over again. The Bears game played low in the background while Amelia folded napkins for Thanksgiving dinner at my kitchen island, like she already lived there part-time. Daniel stood beside me rinsing dishes after dinner. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then he said quietly, "You know Amelia means well, right?" I kept my eyes on the sink water. He exhaled slowly. "She's trying to help us get organized. Us, not you. Us." I turned the faucet off. "What exactly needs organizing?" Daniel looked genuinely frustrated suddenly. "Mom, why does every conversation feel defensive lately?" The question caught me off guard, because part of me had been asking myself the same thing privately. Maybe I was defensive. Maybe grief had sharpened my nerves. Maybe I really was becoming harder to help. That uncertainty was beginning to wear me down more than anything else. Daniel dried his hands with a dish towel and leaned against the counter. "I just don't want something happening and nobody being prepared." Something happening. Again, vague, future-focused, quietly unsettling. What does that mean? He rubbed his forehead. "It means Dad handled everything for 40 years, and now you're alone in a huge house trying to manage winter and paperwork and all this other stuff by yourself." There was no cruelty in his voice. That's important. If anything, he sounded scared. Tired, too, like somebody trying desperately to convince himself he was being responsible instead of intrusive. Amelia walked back into the kitchen carrying leftover pie containers. The mood shifted immediately after she entered. Not dramatically, just enough that Daniel stopped talking. She glanced between us carefully. "Everything okay?" Daniel nodded too quickly. "Yeah, just tired." Amelia smiled softly and touched his shoulder on her way past him. Such a small gesture. Still, I noticed how Daniel physically relaxed afterward. Later that night, after they finally left, I carried a mug of tea upstairs and paused again outside Harold's office. The hallway smelled faintly like dust and cedar from the old attic insulation. Wind rattled the gutters outside, while snow tapped lightly against the windows. I stared at the locked office door longer than usual, not because I thought some huge secret sat behind it, mostly because the lock itself had started bothering me. Harold hated locked doors inside the house, said it made family feel temporary. I reached for the handle again anyway, still locked. But this time, I noticed something else. The rug beneath the office doors looked slightly crooked, like someone had shifted it and never put it back exactly right. Maybe meaningless, maybe not. I stood there listening to the old house settle around me, while a strange thought slowly took shape for the first time. I no longer knew whether Daniel and Amelia were trying to protect me or prepare for me.
Thanksgiving came and went in a blur of casseroles, football, and careful conversations. By then, the rhythm inside my house had changed enough that even small, quiet moments felt unfamiliar. Amelia hosted most of Thanksgiving dinner at my place, exactly the way she suggested she would. Folding tables in the dining room, extra chairs borrowed from church, turkey warming trays spread across my kitchen counters, while the Lions game played low in the den for background noise nobody really watched. From the outside, it looked warm, family-filled, comfortable, normal. And honestly, parts of it were. That's what made everything so confusing. Daniel laughed more that afternoon than he had in weeks. My granddaughter Emma helped me frost pumpkin bars, while Amelia moved through the kitchen effortlessly, managing timers and side dishes and people all at once. Everyone complimented her organization. "She really keeps things together," Doris whispered to me at one point, while balancing sweet potatoes on her plate. I smiled automatically, because technically it was true. The trouble with subtle control is that it often looks identical to competence. After dinner, while people settled into football and pie, I found Amelia alone in the kitchen, scraping leftovers into storage containers. "Sit down," she told me gently. "You've been on your feet all day." "I'm all right." "I know," she smiled without looking up. "Still, you don't have to prove anything." The sentence bothered me more than it should have. Not because it sounded cruel, because it sounded caring enough that questioning it made me feel unreasonable. Outside, snow flurries drifted past the backyard lights, while somebody's children screamed happily a few houses down. Thanksgiving in suburban Illinois always carried the same feeling once evening settled in. Warm windows against cold, dark streets. Harold loved that time of year. He used to fall asleep halfway through football, with pie balanced on his stomach, while pretending he was just resting his eyes. I still looked toward his chair sometimes before remembering. That part never arrived gradually. It hit fresh every single time.
A few days after Thanksgiving, I started noticing Amelia mentioning my grief differently around other people. Never harshly, never dramatically, just carefully. One Sunday after church, a woman named Carol stopped me near the coffee station. "How are you holding up?" she asked softly. "Amelia said the holidays have been especially emotional for you." "Emotional?" I smiled politely. "They've been difficult." Carol squeezed my arm sympathetically before drifting away toward the pastry table. The interaction lasted maybe 30 seconds. Still, it stayed with me all afternoon. Because I couldn't remember telling Amelia I was struggling emotionally. Sad sometimes, yes. Lonely often. But emotional carried a different implication somehow. Less grief, more instability. Maybe I was overthinking it. By early December, Christmas decorations had taken over the neighborhood completely. Inflatable snowmen, white lights wrapped around gutters, plastic reindeer sinking sideways into frozen lawns. Daniel came by one Saturday morning to hang wreaths on my porch because the latter made him nervous. Again, reasonable. The thing about slow manipulation is that every individual moment sounds harmless in isolation. "You shouldn't be climbing around in icy weather," he said, while tightening ribbon around the porch railing. "I've decorated this house since before you could drive." "I know." He laughed lightly. "Humor me. Humor me." Another phrase designed to soften resistance. Inside, Amelia reorganized kitchen cabinets while Christmas music played softly from her phone. At some point, I opened the wrong drawer looking for scissors and realized she'd moved half my baking supplies without mentioning it. "Sorry," she called from across the kitchen when she noticed me searching. I grouped everything together to make things easier. Again, easier. Every adjustment now arrived wrapped in convenience. I found myself hesitating before doing ordinary things inside my own house because I no longer knew where anything belonged anymore. That realization unsettled me more than I wanted to admit.
One snowy Tuesday evening, Daniel stopped by after work looking especially worn down. His coat smelled like cold air and coffee when he hugged me. Snow clung to his shoes near the entryway, while local news warned about another winter storm moving across DuPage County overnight. "You look tired," I said. He gave a quiet laugh. "Join the club." We ate leftover chili in the kitchen while Amelia picked up prescriptions from CVS. For a while, it almost felt like old times again. Then Daniel started talking about refinancing. Not my house, his. "Rates are killing us," he muttered while scrolling through something on his phone. "Everything keeps going up at the same time."
I listened quietly. Between Emma's tuition, the mortgage, and taxes, he shook his head. Feels like everybody our age is barely holding things together. This was different than before. Less polished, less careful, real strain finally showing through. I thought about asking directly whether money problems were worse than he'd admitted, but before I could, he looked around the kitchen slowly. "You know," he said, "Dad probably should have downsized years ago." I set my spoon down. "Your father loved this house." "I know." Daniel sighed heavily. "I'm just saying, financially it would have made more sense." Financially. Always back to that. I looked at him for a long moment. "You seem very worried about finances lately." The room shifted slightly after that. Not hostile, just uncomfortable. Daniel rubbed both hands together like he suddenly regretted saying too much. "I'm trying to think long-term now," he said quietly. "That's all." Long-term. Another phrase I'd started hearing constantly. Future planning, preparedness, stability. Words that sounded responsible, while quietly moving authority away from the person being discussed.
Amelia came home before the conversation could go further. The mood changed almost immediately. Daniel sat straighter, stopped venting, started smiling again. I noticed that too. Later that evening, Amelia helped me clean the kitchen after dinner, while snow fell heavily outside the windows. "You know Daniel worries because he loves you," she said while drying dishes. "I know he does. He just doesn't want everything falling on you all at once." Everything. Bills, maintenance, paperwork, winter, grief. The list always remained vague enough to avoid argument. Amelia stacked clean plates carefully into cabinets she now organized better than I did. Then she added softly, "Sometimes people don't realize how overwhelmed they are until someone else steps in." The comment landed strangely. Not quite criticism, not quite concern. Something in between. I kept rinsing dishes without answering. And for the first time, I noticed Amelia watching me the way nurses sometimes watch elderly patients, trying to hide discomfort. Not cruelly, assessing. That feeling followed me upstairs later that night. The house had grown colder since the storm started. Wind rattled softly against the windows, while distant snowplows scraped through the subdivision. I passed Harold's office again on my way to bed, still locked. But this time I noticed the light underneath the door, very faint, almost gone before I registered it. I stopped walking. The upstairs hallway stood completely quiet around me, except for the heater humming through the vents. For a second, I genuinely wondered whether I imagined it. Then the light disappeared completely. I stood there, holding the banister tighter than necessary, because Daniel and Amelia had left over an hour earlier. And suddenly, for the first time since Harold died, I no longer felt entirely alone inside my own house. The week before Christmas, I started sleeping with the television on downstairs. Not because I was afraid exactly. I just couldn't stand how quiet the house became after midnight anymore. Harold used to snore softly in his recliner during late-night news reruns, while snow fell outside the windows. Now the room settled differently. Pipes clicked, floorboards shifted. Every sound felt larger in winter, especially when you lived alone, or at least when you thought you did. A few days after I noticed the light beneath Harold's office door, I convinced myself I'd imagined it. Grief does strange things to your sense of certainty. You start second-guessing perfectly ordinary memories. Maybe headlights from outside reflected under the door. Maybe I was overtired. Maybe the upstairs hallway light caught the angle wrong. I wanted a reasonable explanation. That alone should have told me something. By mid-December, Daniel and Amelia practically had a routine inside my house. Sunday dinners, Wednesday grocery runs, pharmacy pickups, mail stacked neatly by category on the counter before I even saw it. The strangest part was how quickly a person can get displaced inside their own life without anyone ever directly asking permission. One snowy Thursday morning, I walked into the kitchen and found Amelia replacing my old wall calendar with a larger one covered in color-coded notes. Doctor appointments, church events, utility reminders, medication refill dates. "Oh good, you're up," she said brightly. "I thought this might make things easier to keep track of." I stared at the calendar longer than necessary. "I already had one." "I know," she smiled lightly. "This just has bigger print." Again, reasonable. I hated how often reasonable things made me feel defensive now.
Outside, snowplows scraped slowly through the subdivision, while local traffic reports played softly from the television. Somebody across the street struggled to start their SUV in the cold. Ordinary winter morning, yet somehow my own kitchen no longer felt entirely organized around me. Amelia poured coffee into my mug before I could reach for the pot. Cream and 2 sugars, right? I can still make my own coffee. The words came out sharper than I intended. Amelia paused only briefly. Of course you can. Then she handed me the mug anyway. No argument, no tension, which almost made me feel worse, because difficult people are easier to resist than helpful ones.
That afternoon, Daniel came over after work, carrying a small space heater for the upstairs bathroom. Menards had them on sale, he said, while unboxing it near the hallway closet. You two spend more time buying things for this house than I do. Daniel laughed faintly. Somebody has to keep this place running. He meant it jokingly, I think. Still, the comment lingered with me later while I folded laundry upstairs. Somebody has to keep this place running. Not helping me, running the house. The language around me had started shifting in subtle ways. I noticed that more and more. A few days later, Amelia offered to drive me to my follow-up appointment for my knee. You don't need to take off work for that. I work remote Fridays anyway, she said, and honestly, parking at Northwestern is a nightmare. Again, reasonable. The waiting room smelled like antiseptic and burnt coffee, while daytime talk shows played on a mounted television nobody watched. Amelia sat beside me, scrolling emails on her phone, while I filled out paperwork on a clipboard. Halfway through the forms, the receptionist looked at Amelia and asked, "Daughter?" Before I could answer, Amelia smiled politely. "Daughter-in-law." The receptionist nodded approvingly. "It's nice she comes with you." Something about the exchange unsettled me more than it should have, not because Amelia corrected her, because she looked comfortable in the role immediately, comfortable speaking for me, comfortable managing details, comfortable being perceived as caretaker. On the drive home, snow drifted lightly across the roads while Christmas music played low through the car speakers. Amelia kept both hands steady on the wheel. "You know," she said carefully, "Daniel's just worried you take too much on by yourself." I looked out the passenger window at gray shopping centers sliding past. "I've managed my life a long time." "I know you have." There it was again, always agreement before redirection. She parked at a red light and glanced toward me briefly. "But sometimes, after a loss like Harold," she hesitated gently, "people don't realize how exhausted they are until someone helps carry things for them." Carry things for them. Soft phrasing, warm tone. Still, something inside me tightened again, because lately every conversation seemed to circle the same idea. You don't need to manage your own life anymore. That realization followed me home. The next Sunday, Daniel came over early before the Bears game, carrying coffee and donuts from Dunkin'. He looked terrible. Not evil, not manipulative. Worn down. There's a difference. We sat at the kitchen island while snow fell steadily outside, and pregame commentators argued on television about playoff chances neither of us cared much about. Daniel rubbed his forehead constantly now when stressed. Mortgage paperwork sat partially visible inside his work bag. Refinancing documents, maybe? I didn't ask. Eventually, he sighed and looked around the kitchen quietly. Dad really kept everything together around here. The comment sounded heavier than usual. I stirred sweetener into my coffee. He liked taking care of things. Yeah. Daniel stared down at the counter. I don't think I realized how much pressure he absorbed. Pressure. Another word appearing more often lately. Financial pressure, life pressure, responsibility. Daniel had started talking like someone balancing too many bills and too little sleep. I'm fine, Daniel. I know you think that. I looked up slowly. He noticed immediately and corrected himself. That's not what I meant. Then what did you mean? Daniel leaned back heavily in the chair. He stopped. Tried again. Mom, if something happened unexpectedly, I wouldn't even know where half the account information is. Not greed, not hostility. Fear. That was what made all this so difficult to untangle emotionally, because fear and control often wear the same face in families. Before I could answer, Amelia walked in, carrying grocery bags from Trader Joe's. The mood shifted immediately again. She unpacked vegetables while Daniel grew quieter beside me. I started noticing that too. How often conversations changed once she entered the room. Not because she demanded control outright, more because Daniel seemed to reorganize himself around her presence automatically. That night after dinner, Amelia cleaned the kitchen while Daniel watched football highlights in the den. I dried dishes beside her quietly. "You know," she said gently, "Daniel's been having trouble sleeping." I glanced over. "He worries." Again, worries. He's under a lot right now between work and everything else. Everything else. Bills, maybe. Debt. Marriage pressure. The future. Amelia stacked plates carefully into cabinets she reorganized weeks ago. Then she added, "He just wants everyone stable." Stable. Another word that lingered unpleasantly after she said it. Not happy, not close. Stable. I rinsed a casserole dish under warm water and listened to the heater hum through the vents. "You make me sound fragile," I said finally. Amelia stopped drying dishes for the first time all evening. Then she smiled softly. "No," she said. "I think you've been carrying too much alone for too long." The answer was almost perfect. Gentle, compassionate, hard to argue against, which was exactly why it stayed with me afterward. Later that night, after they left, I went upstairs to change into pajamas and noticed something odd near the hallway linen closet. A cardboard file box sat partially pushed behind extra blankets. I didn't remember putting it there. Maybe Daniel moved it while helping organize decorations earlier that week. Maybe Harold stored it years ago and I forgot. Still, I pulled it out slowly. Inside were old household folders, insurance papers, tax receipts, expired warranties, normal things. Then I noticed several newer folders mixed in near the bottom. Handwriting I recognized immediately. Amelia's. Neat labels across the tabs. Utilities. Medical. Emergency contacts. And beneath them, house access. I stared at that folder for several long seconds before opening it. Inside was a spare garage remote, a written alarm code, copies of house keys. Nothing criminal, nothing dramatic. Actually, all fairly practical things for family members to have during winter emergencies. Still, my pulse slowed in a way I couldn't explain. Because suddenly I realized something that left me standing motionless in the hallway long after midnight. Daniel and Amelia were no longer simply helping me manage life after Harold. Little by little, they had started preparing to operate my life without me.
A few days before Christmas, I stopped correcting people when they assumed Daniel and Amelia were basically living with me. It happened more often than I expected. Neighbors waving from driveways, "Good thing your son's around now." Women at church, "You're lucky Amelia's so involved." Even the cashier at Walgreens smiled one afternoon and said, "Your daughter was just here picking up your prescription earlier." Not daughter-in-law, daughter. And somehow, Amelia never corrected people unless she absolutely had to. I told myself none of it mattered. Still, the feeling stayed with me, like my role inside my own life was slowly being rewritten in conversations I wasn't fully part of anymore. The Sunday before Christmas Eve, Daniel came over early to help hang outdoor lights after freezing rain coated half the neighborhood overnight. The subdivision looked gray and heavy under the weather. Salt trucks crawled slowly down Sycamore Lane, while neighbors chipped ice off windshields in thick winter gloves. Daniel stood on the front porch untangling extension cords while I held the storm door open behind him. "You really don't need all these lights," he muttered. "Your father liked them. Dad also liked keeping every thermostat at 74. I smiled despite myself. For a moment, he sounded normal again. Just my son. Then he glanced toward the driveway. "You should probably think about getting snow service next year." "I've managed snow before." "I know." He adjusted the ladder carefully. "I'm just saying it's easier having systems in place before something happens." Before something happens. That phrase again. Not immediate danger, just future concern, hanging permanently in the air now. I noticed how often conversations around me had started revolving around preparation. Preparation for weather. Preparation for emergencies. Preparation for stress. And slowly, underneath all of it, another quieter idea. Preparation for me becoming less capable. Later that afternoon, Amelia arrived carrying grocery bags and 3 different kinds of Christmas cookies from a bakery in Wheaton. The kitchen immediately filled with the smell of butter and peppermint while she unpacked containers onto the counter like she belonged there, which maybe by then she partly did. That's the uncomfortable truth nobody talks about after loss. Grief creates open space inside families, and eventually someone always steps in to organize the emptiness. The question is whether they're helping you carry it
or rearranging the room around themselves. Amelia brushed snow off her coat and looked toward the dining room. "You still have mail stacked over there," she said lightly. "I was going through it." "I know," she smiled gently. "I just don't want things slipping through the cracks." Again, reasonable. I hated how often my instincts and logic argued with each other now, because nothing Amelia did look openly controlling. If anything, she looked competent. That was what made everything harder to explain, even to myself. That evening, the three of us ate takeout Italian food in the den, while a Christmas movie played quietly in the background. Snow fell steadily outside the windows, softening the neighborhood into white and gold porch lights. Daniel looked distracted most of the night, phone buzzing, checking emails, rubbing tension out of his jaw. Finally, Amelia looked over at him. "You okay?" He exhaled heavily. "Mortgage company again." The words came out before he could stop them. The room shifted slightly afterward. Not dramatic, just honest for the first time in a while. Amelia looked uncomfortable immediately. "You don't need to talk about that tonight. It's fine." Daniel rubbed his forehead. "Everything's just expensive right now."
I stayed quiet and let him continue. Rates went up again. Property taxes are insane. Emma's school tuition keeps climbing. He laughed softly, but there wasn't much humor in it. "Feels like everybody our age is one emergency away from drowning." There it was. Not greed, not some elaborate scheme. Pressure. Middle-aged American pressure. Debt, housing, bills, fear. For the first time in weeks, I understood something important. Daniel wasn't trying to take over my life because he wanted power. He was scared of instability. And scared people start justifying things they never imagined themselves doing. Amelia reached over and touched his arm gently. "We're figuring it out." Such a small moment. Still, I noticed Daniel physically calm down afterward, the way he always did around her. That bothered me more lately than it used to. Not because I disliked Amelia, because I was starting to realize how much of Daniel's thinking now moved through her first. After dinner, Amelia cleaned the kitchen while Daniel took a work call upstairs. I wrapped leftovers into foil while she loaded the dishwasher. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then Amelia said quietly, "He's been carrying a lot. I can see that. He worries about everybody." I nodded, but kept folding aluminum foil carefully around leftover lasagna. Amelia leaned against the counter for a second. "I don't think he expected losing Harold to affect things financially this much." I looked up slowly. "Financially how?" She hesitated. "Not dramatically, just enough to seem careful. You know, estate delays, taxes, market stuff. Everything's tied up longer than people expect."
Again, nothing shocking. Actually believable. But hearing her say it out loud connected several pieces in my mind that had been floating around separately for weeks. The paperwork, the urgency, the constant conversations about preparedness and stability. I dried my hands slowly on a kitchen towel. "Is Daniel in trouble?" "No," Amelia answered quickly. Too quickly. "Nothing like that." Then she softened her voice. "He just wants everyone protected." Protected. Another word that sounded warm until you sat with it long enough. From what, exactly? I almost asked. But Daniel's footsteps crossed upstairs before I could. The conversation disappeared as fast as it arrived. A couple days later, I stopped by Richard Lawson's office downtown to sign a few remaining estate documents. Snow lined the sidewalks outside, while Christmas music played quietly through the building lobby. Richard had known Harold for nearly 30 years. He still wore the same navy ties and polished loafers Harold used to tease him about. "You doing all right?" he asked after we sat down. "Mostly." He studied me for a second longer than usual. Not suspiciously, carefully. Then he slid paperwork across the desk. Routine trust documents, tax filings, account transfers, ordinary things. Still, midway through signing, Richard cleared his throat. "Maureen, I just want to remind you, if anyone asks you to make changes to property access, financial authority, or healthcare paperwork, don't feel pressured to handle it quickly." The comment landed softly, professional, measured, but very deliberate. I looked up. Why would anyone pressure me? Richard adjusted his glasses slowly. "I'm not suggesting anyone would," he paused. "I just know families sometimes start making practical decisions quickly after a loss." Practical. There was that word again. Only now it sounded different coming from him. Not comforting. Cautionary. The drive home felt longer than usual after that.
Snowbanks crowded the roadsides, while radio hosts argued about holiday travel delays. Minivans packed grocery store parking lots. Every house in the subdivision glowed with Christmas lights against the dark winter sky. Normal suburban life. Yet by then, something inside me had shifted quietly. Not panic, awareness. Because for the first time, someone outside the family had gently confirmed I wasn't imagining the pressure around me. That night, I sat alone in the kitchen long after everyone left. The dishwasher hummed softly. Wind pushed snow against the windows. Harold's old coffee mug sat drying beside the sink. I stared at the calendar Amelia reorganized weeks earlier. Appointments, medication reminders, notes in her handwriting. My house, my routines, my life, organized by someone else. Then I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. In the corner of the calendar, beside my orthopedist follow-up appointment, Amelia had written, "Check driving situation afterward." I stared at the words for a long time. Maybe she meant winter driving. Maybe she meant my knee. Maybe it was completely innocent. Still, for the first time since Harold died, I began wondering whether Daniel and Amelia had already started discussing my future in ways I hadn't fully heard yet.
By the second week of January, the house no longer felt arranged around my habits. That realization came quietly one morning while I stood in my own kitchen looking for cinnamon. I opened 3 different cabinets before remembering Amelia had reorganized the baking supplies before Christmas. Such a small thing. Still, I stood there longer than necessary, holding the spice jar in my hand, suddenly overwhelmed by how many ordinary routines no longer happened automatically anymore. Not because I was confused, because somebody else had started making decisions before I could. Outside, dirty snowbanks lined the subdivision streets, while salt trucks rattled through the neighborhood before sunrise. Christmas decorations still hung on half the houses, because January in suburban Illinois always exhausted people before they found the energy to take anything down. Harold used to complain about that too. "Town looks tired after New Year's," he'd say every winter. The town did look tired. Honestly, so did I. Daniel and Amelia had fallen into a pattern after the holidays. Daniel stopped by after work several evenings a week. Amelia handled grocery runs while she was already out. Packages arrived addressed to me that I hadn't ordered myself. Vitamin organizers, a heavier bath mat, motion sensor nightlights for the upstairs hallway. Practical things, helpful things, the kind of purchases nobody can reasonably object to without sounding defensive. One Thursday afternoon, Amelia came over while I was folding laundry in the den. The local news played softly in the background about rising heating bills and another incoming snowstorm. A half-finished crossword puzzle sat beside Harold's old reading chair. Amelia carried in reusable grocery bags and immediately started unloading produce onto the counter. "I picked up soup containers too," she said. "You shouldn't be lifting heavy pots if your knee's bothering you." "My knee is fine." "I know," she smiled lightly. "I'm just trying to make things easier on you." Always easier. That word had become so common in my house, it practically echoed off the walls now. I folded another towel slowly. "I managed perfectly well before all this." Amelia paused just briefly. "Before all what?" The question landed softly enough to sound sincere. I looked down at the towel in my hands. "Before everyone started worrying about whether I can function." For the first time in weeks, Amelia didn't immediately smooth the conversation over. Instead, she sat carefully on the edge of the couch across from me. "No one thinks you can't function." Then she added, more carefully, "I think people just notice grief differently from the outside than we do ourselves sometimes." Outside. The word lingered with me after she said it, because lately I had started feeling watched in subtle ways. Not monitored exactly, observed. If I forgot where I left my glasses, somebody noticed. If I sounded tired, somebody commented. If I mentioned feeling overwhelmed, it somehow reappeared later in conversations about stress or safety. Not dramatic enough to confront directly, just enough to make me increasingly aware of myself inside my own home. That evening, Daniel came by carrying takeout chili from Portillo's because the weather forecast warned freezing rain overnight. He looked exhausted again, more than usual. His coat stayed on through dinner, like he didn't have energy to settle fully into the evening. Halfway through eating, Emma called asking about tuition paperwork for spring semester.
Daniel muted the phone afterward and rubbed his face hard with both hands. "Everything costs money," he muttered quietly. The comment slipped out before he seemed to realize he'd said it aloud. Amelia looked toward him immediately. "You need to breathe." "I am breathing." But he didn't sound calm. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The television flickered quietly in the den, while wind pushed sleet against the kitchen windows. Then Daniel looked at me. "Mom, have you thought any more about maybe letting somebody help with bill management stuff?" There it was again. Not control, not authority. Help. With what exactly? Just organization. He leaned forward immediately. Automatic payments, reminders, making sure nothing gets missed. I haven't missed anything. I know. Too fast again. Always too fast. Daniel set his fork down carefully. It's not about capability. Then what is it about? I almost asked. But part of me already knew the answer wasn't simple anymore. Because Daniel genuinely believed some of what he was saying. That was becoming clearer all the time. He wasn't trying to hurt me. He was trying to reduce uncertainty. The problem was, he had slowly started treating my independence itself like a form of risk.
After dinner, Daniel offered to take the trash bins down to the curb before the storm hit. I watched him through the front window, pulling his coat tighter against the wind while snow flurries spun beneath the streetlights. For a second, he looked young again, just my son doing winter chores, not somebody quietly helping reorganize my life around his fears. That contradiction exhausted me more than anger would have. Later that night, while Amelia loaded the dishwasher, she spoke without turning around. "You know Daniel's terrified something will happen to you." I dried dishes beside her. "People keep saying that. Nobody ever explains what something means." Amelia stopped stacking plates for a moment. Then, maybe because everybody watched Harold decline faster than they expected. The room felt colder after that. Not because the comment was cruel, because it sounded honest. And honesty can sometimes move people further toward control than manipulation ever could. Amelia closed the dishwasher softly. "He feels responsible now." Responsible. That word made more sense than all the others. Not greedy, not calculating. Responsible. A dangerous emotion in families when mixed with fear and money. I carried my tea upstairs after they left and noticed another subtle change waiting for me. The upstairs hallway nightlights were already plugged in, motion activated, soft amber light glowing automatically as I walked past. I stood there staring at them longer than necessary. Maybe Amelia installed them earlier while I was downstairs. Maybe Daniel did. Either way, nobody had asked first, and somehow that mattered more than the lights themselves. A few days later, I met Doris and 2 women from church for lunch at Panera after Sunday service. The restaurant smelled like tomato soup and wet winter coats, while exhausted parents tried keeping children occupied near the bakery case. Doris stirred sweetener into her coffee and smiled at me carefully. "You look tired." "I probably am." "Well," she hesitated slightly, "at least Daniel and Amelia are helping out." Again, that phrase, helping out. Another woman nodded approvingly. "Your daughter-in-law is wonderful. Amelia told Carol she's been trying to keep you from overdoing things." Overdoing things. I felt my stomach tighten slightly. Not because the words sounded insulting, because they sounded plausible. That was what frightened me most by then. Nobody around me would ever see obvious control happening. They would only see capable, younger adults helping a grieving widow manage life after loss. And maybe that's exactly how Daniel and Amelia saw it too. On the drive home, freezing rain tapped steadily against my windshield while traffic crawled along Route 59. I kept thinking about something Richard Lawson said weeks earlier. Families start making practical decisions quickly after a loss. At the time, I thought he meant paperwork. Now I wasn't so sure. That evening, I decided to look through the downstairs file cabinet myself for the first time since Harold died. Nothing dramatic, mostly insurance records and tax folders. Still, while sorting paperwork, I noticed several utility accounts now listed Daniel's email address alongside mine for notifications. Not ownership changes, not account transfers, just access. Small adjustments, gradual adjustments. The
the kind that accumulate quietly over time, until one day, somebody else already knows more about your daily life than you do. I sat there at the dining room table for a long time after noticing it. The house hummed softly around me, dishwasher running, heater clicking on, wind pressing against the windows. And for the first time since Harold passed, I stopped asking myself whether I was imagining the shift happening inside my family. Because by then, the question wasn't whether things were changing. The question was how far those changes were eventually supposed to go. By late January, I had stopped expecting my house to feel like mine again. That realization didn't arrive dramatically. It came one cold Tuesday morning while I stood in my own driveway watching Daniel back my car out for me because the roads were icy. "I can drive myself," I told him through the open passenger window. "I know you can." He kept both hands on the wheel. "The side streets are slick today. Humor me." Humor me. Another soft phrase that made resistance sound unreasonable. Snowbanks crowded both sides of Sycamore Lane, while exhaust drifted white into the frozen morning air. Across the street, Mr. Jensen struggled with a snowblower that never seemed to start properly. Normal winter suburbia. And there I was, sitting in the passenger seat of my own car, feeling strangely like a guest inside my own routines.
The orthopedic appointment itself lasted less than 30 minutes. Mild inflammation, continue physical therapy, be careful on ice. Ordinary aging, nothing alarming. But on the drive home, Daniel kept asking questions in that careful tone people use when they're trying not to sound worried. "You still getting dizzy sometimes?" "I was never getting dizzy." "You mentioned feeling lightheaded before Christmas." "I said I skipped lunch." He nodded quickly. Right. But he still looked unconvinced. That stayed with me afterward. Not because I thought Daniel was trying to invent problems, because I realized he had started collecting small moments differently than I had. A forgotten grocery item became stress. A missed lunch became lightheadedness. A tired afternoon became exhaustion. Piece by piece, ordinary aging had started turning into evidence of vulnerability, and maybe he didn't even realize he was doing it. A few days later, Amelia stopped by while I was sorting mail at the kitchen table. The neighborhood looked gray and slushy after another week of snowstorms. Salt stained the sidewalks white. Somebody nearby had left Christmas lights up so long they no longer looked festive, just tired. Amelia carried grocery bags inside and immediately noticed the stack of unopened envelopes beside me. "You should let Daniel switch more of these to paperless." "I like paper statements." "I know." She unpacked yogurt into the refrigerator. "I just worry things pile up on you." Pile up. Everything lately sounded like a burden waiting to happen. I kept sorting envelopes quietly.
Then Amelia glanced toward the hallway. "You still keeping Harold's office closed?" The question caught me off guard. "It's locked." "Oh." She paused briefly. "Daniel thought maybe you just didn't want to go in there yet." I looked up slowly. Why would Daniel think about Harold's office? The room shifted slightly after that. Not confrontation, just caution. Amelia closed the refrigerator gently before answering. "He's trying to make sure important paperwork doesn't get lost." Again, reasonable. Always reasonable. That was what made the entire situation feel so disorienting emotionally. Nobody sounded cruel enough to hate. They sounded concerned, practical, prepared, which somehow hurt worse. That Sunday, Daniel invited me over for dinner instead of coming to my house. The first thing I noticed walking inside was how expensive everything suddenly looked. New bar stools, new coffee machine, fresh paint in the downstairs bathroom. Nothing extravagant. Still, I remembered the stress in Daniel's voice talking about refinancing only weeks earlier. That contradiction sat quietly in the back of my mind through dinner. Emma talked about school applications, while Amelia passed around roasted chicken and mashed potatoes. A football game played softly from the family room while snow tapped against the windows. Warm, normal, American. Exactly the kind of evening nobody would ever associate with betrayal. Halfway through dinner, Daniel mentioned a coworker dealing with elder care issues for his mother. "Complete nightmare," he muttered. Nobody had legal stuff organized beforehand. I kept my eyes on my plate. Amelia spoke carefully after a moment. "Honestly, families avoid those conversations way too long." There it was again. Not directed at me exactly, just placed gently into the room like something everyone should agree with. Daniel nodded. "If something happens suddenly, everybody scrambles." "Something happens, always vague, always future-oriented." I took a sip of iced tea. "What exactly do you both think is going to happen to me?"
The room went quiet for the first time all evening. Not hostile, just surprised.
Emma looked awkward immediately and excused herself upstairs with her plate. Daniel sighed heavily. "Mom, nobody thinks something's wrong with you." "Then why do I constantly feel disgust?" That landed harder than I intended. Amelia answered first. "I'm sorry if it feels that way." Careful wording. Not, "We aren't discussing you." Just, "Sorry it feels that way." Daniel rubbed his forehead again. "Or trying to plan responsibly, that's all." "For what?" He looked genuinely frustrated now. "For life." His voice rose slightly before settling again. "For emergencies, for stability. Dad handled everything forever, and now everybody's pretending we shouldn't talk about what happens next." There it was. Not greed, fear mixed with responsibility. A middle-aged son trying to control uncertainty before uncertainty controlled him. I could suddenly see the entire emotional shape of it. That was the terrible part. Understanding them made it harder to stay angry. Dinner ended awkwardly after that. Not explosive, not dramatic, just strained, in the quiet suburban way families often fracture, through lowered voices and dishes cleaned too carefully. Amelia wrapped leftovers into containers, while Daniel avoided eye contact loading the dishwasher. I stood near the sink drying glasses nobody really needed drying yet. Then Amelia said something softly without turning around. "No one's trying to replace you, Maureen." Replace. Such a revealing choice of word. I stared at the back of her sweater while cold realization slowly settled through me. Because I had never accused anyone of replacing me, which meant somewhere underneath all the practical conversations and helpful routines, the possibility already existed in her mind too. On the drive home, freezing rain blurred the streetlights into watery gold smears across my windshield. The subdivision looked almost identical to every other winter night Harold and I had spent there over 4 decades. But inside me, something had changed permanently. For months, I had kept trying to decide whether Daniel and Amelia were manipulating me intentionally. Now I understood the truth was more complicated. Daniel was terrified. Amelia was organized. Grief had created confusion. Money had added pressure. And somewhere inside all of that, my independence had slowly become negotiable without anyone openly admitting it. That realization hurt more than outright cruelty would have, because villains are easier to leave emotionally. Family is harder. When I got home, the house felt especially cold. I locked the front door, hung my coat carefully beside Harold's old winter jacket, and stood in the kitchen listening to the refrigerator hum. Mail sat stacked neatly where Amelia organized it earlier that week. The motion lights glowed softly upstairs. My medication reminders were already written across the oversized calendar in someone else's handwriting. Nothing dramatic, just layer upon layer of gradual accommodation. I made tea and carried it upstairs slowly. As I passed Harold's office, I stopped again outside the locked door. For several seconds, I just stood there in the dim hallway light. Then, for reasons I still can't completely explain, I stopped trying the handle. Because deep down, I think I finally understood something important. The office itself wasn't the real issue anymore. The real issue was that little by little, I had spent months reacting emotionally to changes, instead of preparing myself calmly for what those changes meant. And for the first time since Harold died, I stopped feeling confused. I started paying attention.